Hello and welcome to this edition of the CMEX webinar series. My name is Mark Carson and I'm the Genetic Solutions Manager here at CMEX, and I will be moderating this session today. Over the next hour, we will be digging into how to achieve high production, health, and fertility, which is an interesting area of dairy health management and is one that has caused great debates over the years. To tackle this subject, it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Stephen LeBlanc. Stephen is a professor in the Dairy Department of Population Medicine at the Ontario Veterinary College and director of Dairy at Guelph, the Center of Dairy Research and Innovation at the University of Guelph. Stephen received his Bachelor's of Agriculture in Animal Science from McGill University in 1992 and a DVM, Doctor in Veterinary Medicine, in 1997 and a DVSC in 2001, all from the University of Guelph. After 5 years of private veterinary practice, he joined the faculty of the University of Guelph, where he now teaches veterinary students and provides clinical farm service. In the past, he's past president of the Dairy Cattle Reproductive Council and served 6 years as section and senior editor of the Journal of Dairy Science. His research is focused on dairy health metabolics, reproductive health, management of precision technologies, and antimicrobial stewardship. With his graduate students and collaborators, his work has resulted in over 165 peer-reviewed papers. And he's also given presentations in over 20 countries. Before we get started, if you have any questions during this presentation, please click on the Q&A at the bottom of the screen and then type in the question box. We will bring them up and address them at the end of the presentation. And with that, Stephen, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about fertility and production and see what kind of debate we can cause today. So floor is yours, Stephen.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks to CMEX for this opportunity. And finally, thanks to all the many participants from many different countries who are tuning in to join us today. As Mark said, we're going to tackle this knotty question of the triad or the trifecta or the triple crown of health, reproductive performance, and production or milk yield. As mentioned, within the Zoom webinar feature, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to put your questions in, which we'll deal with primarily at the end of the webinar. So over the next hour, I will share some thoughts, some perspectives, perhaps challenge a little bit of dogma, and share some data that try to answer the question of whether we can have health, high fertility, and high production all together. In other words, have the triple crown rather than the Bermuda Triangle. If we were in a in-person group, I would often begin by putting this slide up on the screen as I have here and asking various people to identify what this chart depicts. So you can see over time from the 1950s till 2000s, something's going down and something else is going up. And given our topic for today, you could imagine that the thing that's going down is some measure of cows' reproductive performance, and perhaps the thing that's going up is milk yield. But usually we have fun with this and saying, no, in fact, that's not what this depicts. This is, pregnancy per insemination in dairy cows, and it appears to be going down. And this is the price of beer. And is it true that the price of beer has gone up from 1950 over the subsequent 50 years? Well, yes, clearly it's gone up. Did that cause fertility in dairy cows to go down? Well, obviously not. And no one would think that it did. And yet, this really is a graph from a published scientific paper. And in fact, it does show the association between milk production going up over time, as it has in practically every country, and a measure of cows' reproductive performance, in this case, conception risk, or the probability of pregnancy per insemination, apparently going from well over 60% down to 30–35%. However, if you scratch, and I'm sort of picking on this one particular graph and one particular study, but it's really just to illustrate a larger point. If you scratch into the data that are behind this graph and the thought process that's behind it, the details really matter. For example, the data behind the point for cow's pregnancy per insemination in 1975 were based on the cow producing a live calf or aborting, or simply non-return rate, not coming back into heat or being re-inseminated within 100 days of a previous insemination, which of course we all know is going to greatly overestimate the actual proportion pregnant per insemination. Conversely, the data from the late 90s was actually based on confirmed pregnancy diagnosis by a veterinarian, at that time primarily by palpation between 40 and 50 days after insemination. The point being that even if all we were doing was comparing those two bars, they're not directly comparable. They're apples and oranges. They're different types of data. They shouldn't be compared directly one to the other because the outcome measure, pregnancy, was assessed in different ways, and so on. And again, even if we could document that pregnancy per AI was going down over time, it's not necessarily the case that something else, in this case milk production, that was going up at the same time is actually causing it. It's an association, not a cause. Correlation isn't causation. Around that same time, so we're back about 20 years ago now, there was a really important and really well done review paper published by Matt Lucy, who's a friend and colleague and a very productive reproductive scientist. So this is in no way a criticism of him, but this title was very apropos at the time and has been cited many, many times since. And the conclusion of that paper, which you can see in the first two sentences here, I'm paraphrasing, but was that reproductive performance in dairy cows was in a tough situation. It seemed like it was getting worse over time, and that seemingly an important contributing factor was this associated increase in milk production over time, and that perhaps there was an antagonism, that at some point cows couldn't keep making more and more milk as they were doing, and also sustaining reproductive performance. And again, there were data that seemed to support that. Even in this paper and others like it, there's a number of details that Matt Lucy went on to describe and put some nuance around that. But of course, the headline that was often cited was reproductive performance is bad, it's getting worse. And it somehow seems to be attributable to an antagonism with greater production, and some of the nuances and the details got a little bit lost along the way. Also around the same time, so we're into the early 2000s now, there was some physiology data that also built this story. So again, this is a well-cited study done out of Wisconsin. They took about 300 cows in one very high producing herd, put pressure sensitive transducers on their back, the heat watch system to measure standing heat behavior, and categorize the cows into lower producers and higher producers. So they were matched for days in milk near peak. One group was producing about 46 liters a day, the other about 34 liters a day. And as you can see here, the higher producing cows had a shorter duration of standing heat, stood to be mounted fewer times throughout their heat event, and in total, cumulatively spent a shorter time with another cow on their back, so literally in standing heat. And so the conclusion of this was that higher production is antagonistic, or works against estrus expression. Cows that made more milk showed heat less well. And they went on to show in a series of related experiments that in fact, the mechanisms behind that were that these higher producing cows, if anything, made follicles on their ovaries that were as large as the lower producing cows, or in fact, even a little bit larger. And that in turn is strongly correlated with the production of estrogen, which is the hormone responsible for estrus behavior. And they went on to show that the issue wasn't that these cows had anything wrong with their ovaries, that in fact, if anything, they were likely producing as much or more estradiol, but in fact, it was being broken down, cleared from their body at a higher rate, because to sustain higher production, they have to eat more. When they eat more, they have to metabolize more. They pump blood through their liver at a higher rate to manage digestion of nutrients. And that has the side effect of breaking down reproductive hormones, both estradiol and progesterone, at a higher rate. So the bottom line was that although they made as much estradiol, what was actually pumping through their veins hour to hour was lower. And that was an explanation for why their estrus behavior was less strong. What I want to point out, though, is that finding cows in estrus is really difficult in any case. If you take 22 or 28 seconds of cumulative time being mounted, divided by 3 weeks, the approximate length of an estrus cycle, that's 0.0012 or 1/6% of a cow's time. So either way, finding cows in estrus is quite challenging, and the marginal difference between the two is probably not ultimately what drives heat detection rates in dairy herds. So if we want to talk about reproductive performance, it's one of those areas that has a lot of different ways to measure cow level and herd level performance. And whenever there are a lot of ways to measure something, it suggests that perhaps none of them is perfect. And that's true. But some of them are a lot better and some of them are a lot worse than others. So I'll make the case that for herd monitoring, the single best measure of reproductive performance of a herd of cows now and over time is pregnancy rate, or 21-day pregnancy rate, literally the speed at which open cows are converted into pregnant cows. Conversely, if we only look at, if I breed a cow, what's the probability that she's diagnosed pregnant, also called conception risk, that's obviously important, but that's only one part of the picture. That doesn't speak to when she got inseminated, how efficiently she was inseminated, and so forth. And some of our other traditional measures, like calving intervals or herd average days open, are actually substantially worse because they tend to be, well, they are very biased. And that's a subject for another day. But anything that excludes the cows that failed to get pregnant and just takes the average of the cows that did eventually get pregnant is a severely biased measure, and not one that we should use when we're trying to answer the question, where is reproductive performance? Is it getting better, getting worse? And is it associated with health or production? So the really high level question is there something wrong with our cows? Are our cows broken? Have we not selected for fertility very well? Is there something wrong with our management that we're not able to sustain or support all three of health, fertility, and production? And you're probably already starting to get the spoiler alert that no, I don't think there is anything inherently wrong with our cows or necessarily with our management. However, as cows have the genetic potential and in fact the reality of being more and more high producing animals, that does impose some increased challenges on them. Just like, you know, well, I'll speak for myself, you know, given my level of athletic performance, my diet and my workout program I can get away with a fairly entry level level of attention to that. Conversely, elite athletes have to pay tremendous attention to their workout regimes, their training programs, their diets, and so forth. And so when we're talking about high producing dairy cows who metabolically at peak are doing the equivalent of running about 2 marathons a day in terms of caloric output, well, their demands in terms of nutrition and management and how we look after and support that potential has to be at a very high level. So in other words, if there's an association that as cows eat more, digest more, milk more, that has a bit of a downside for breaking down their reproductive hormones at a greater rate. Well, I don't think anyone would seriously suggest that the solution is to therefore just feed the cows less. That would be absurd. Or even to say, well, let's select against production, and in that way we'll pursue fertility. But again, to go a little bit deeper, if we really want to answer the question, is there an upper limit? Do we hit a point at which there is necessarily a compromise between high production, reproduction, and health spanning the two? Again, I don't think that necessarily there is. However, the challenge is to keep those things in balance and those needs satisfied does become greater and greater. Also, we have to be careful, just like with that graph of one thing going up and something else going down, and we have to be thoughtful about not assuming that one causes the other. Likewise, when we look at data, we have to be careful of having valid measures and not inadvertently drawing wrong conclusions. So for example, if we look retrospectively at very large data sets, it is often true that you'll find that higher producing cows have longer intervals from calving until pregnancy and may well be bred more times. And one interpretation of that is that higher producing cows are harder to get pregnant. However, there's lots of farmers in the audience today. We need to think about, if you have your best cow or your best 10 or 20% of cows in the herd, you breed them once, you breed them twice, they don't get pregnant, do you quit and cull them? Almost certainly not, and almost certainly that is a good economic decision. Conversely, if you have an animal that's in the lower half of your herd and you choose to breed her, but she doesn't get pregnant, well, after a couple of services, you may say, well, that's it. She kind of had her chance and I'm not going to pursue breeding her. And again, generally speaking, that is probably a correct economic management decision. But if hundreds and thousands of farmers do those thought processes and those management decisions over time, if we come along and look at those records in hindsight, we would say, well, geez, look, these higher producing cows take more services, get bred more times, have longer days open, and you might wrongly conclude that that's a cause and effect, when in fact there's selection bias, but correct selection bias as farmers make sensible economic decisions. So again, we need to think about what's an economic and management decision versus what's fundamental biology of the cow. So I'm being a little bit academic or theoretical here, but I think there's some quite practical sides to it. So if we talk about cow fertility, at least I would suggest that refers to biological function. Are cows ovulating? Are they expressing estrus? Are they capable of ovulating a fertile egg, having that egg be fertilized to make an embryo, keeping that embryo alive through 9 months to produce a live calf? Those are all biological processes, most of which are quite difficult to study in the live animal, especially at a large scale. We can ultrasound, we can do experiments where we flush embryos out of cows and so on. So we know something about that, but that's more challenging to measure in a direct way at scale. Conversely, reproductive performance is in part the result of the biology, the result of fertility, and that we can and do measure at scale. And we're talking about, do cows get inseminated? When do they get inseminated? Once they get inseminated, do we diagnose them pregnant? Do they stay pregnant? And that has more to do with management. Do we detect estrus, and or do we correctly implement management programs and protocols to get cows inseminated? Do we use good AI technique and so on? All of these things relate to the underlying biology of the cow, but they're much more easily measurable. And ultimately, which is where we'll go to in a few minutes, health interacts with both. So disease events concurrently or in the cows past, over weeks and months past, influences both their biological function, their fertility, and what we actually measure as producers and advisors, veterinarians, and so on. So has fertility of cows actually declined over time? Well, I've already suggested it. That's far from clear because there's quite a lot of bias or incomplete or non-comparable data that make that a tough question to answer. And so I think perhaps a better question is, are there shortcomings in our management of cows, in our providing of nutrition and management and living conditions, comfortable places to lie down, ventilation, et cetera, to meet the needs of cows that genetically and in reality can and do produce a lot more milk? Because again, people talk about the race car analogy, right? If you drive a cheap Toyota, you can sort of maintain it any old way and it'll probably still run. If you're driving a Formula One race car, everything has to be tuned down to the millimeter. And a cow isn't a machine, but there's still some use to that analogy. And then finally, if there really is or was some decline in true fertility, is that actually because higher milk production caused that? And ultimately, if one pursues that to its logical extreme, should we actually be selecting genetically against high production? And I don't think I've ever found any dairy farmers who really wanted to sign up for that experiment. And in fact, if we look, these are data from the US, and I'll show you some data from Canada in a moment as well, but it's true that over time, over decades, in fact, the genetic trend for various measures of reproduction was downward. It was negative. Part of that was as a result of decisions not to put a lot of weight on reproduction, and conversely to put a lot of weight on production and conformation traits. That was the bad news. The good news, though, is that in both Canada and the US, and indeed other places as well, there was an inflection point approximately 15 years ago where that genetic trend, so for example, in this case, in terms of breeding value for daughter pregnancy rate, you can use other metrics as well, but actually turned a corner, stopped going down, and has started to go in a more favorable direction. And that translates into various phenotypic trends as well. So in this particular example, the phenotype, the actual measured thing from real cows data in the field, is actually going in a very favorable direction. These are some older data from Canada now, but again, the point is simply twofold. Number one, that inflection point was also reached around the same time, roughly 15 years ago, and now the genetic trend for daughter fertility is going in a favorable direction. And importantly, the genetic trend for milk yield has not stopped going up. So we didn't have to trade off lower milk to achieve a better genetic trend and phenotypic trend for reproduction. So if we talk about high production and whether it's antagonistic to reproduction, it's important to take a minute and say, what is high production? Is it a certain number of kilos per day, or is it relative? So one person's top producing cow in their herd might be a very average cow or even a below average cow in the neighbor's herd. Or what might be an average cow in Canada is a very above average cow in another production system. So it's not simply kilos per day or kilos per year. We need to think about relative, so cows compared to their herd mates within a farm, to their respective industry, and so on. So again, 8,000 liters per 305 lactation might be quite a bit in a grass-based seasonal system, and if that's a Canadian Holstein, would be very much below average. So 8,000 liters might seem like a lot in one system and not a lot in the other. So we need to think about that and account for that in trying to answer this question. And so that reminds me always of this parable of the blind men, or in this case, the blind scientists around the elephant. As each one examines a different part of the animal, each draws a conclusion based on their own perceptions that's correct in itself, but of course none of them really has the correct full picture. And I think we often do that in answering this Triple Crown question. We get small pieces of data which may have biases or errors in them, and the conclusions might be right in themselves, but again, they're missing the big picture. So we've got some good data sets to help us answer some of these questions. This is some older data from the United States, published in 2000, but in fact, the data go back well into the 1990s. Big data set, 13,000 cows from 26 herds in New York. And they were trying to answer exactly the question that we have today, which is there an antagonism, or what's the nature of the relationship between level of production and reproductive performance, in this case, the number of days or the speed at which cows are becoming pregnant over time from calving till pregnancy. They looked at milk yield in the first 60 days. That was actually, I think, a really strong part of this study, because the longer you wait through lactation, you start to at least potentially introduce biases as farmers make decisions about breeding cows as a function of how much milk they're making. Here, if we look at what they made before breeding time, that keeps the association a little bit cleaner. And the bottom line was that relative to the lowest producers within this sample of cows and herds, generally speaking, there was no significant difference as the cows went from being a low producer to a medium producer to a high producer. Their time to pregnancy was not longer, was not worse. There were some differences by parity, there were some differences by season, and they certainly didn't have records on all diseases, but for the reproductive diseases that they did have data on, each of those, retained placenta, metritis, and cystic ovaries, was associated with worse, longer time to pregnancy, but not yield in and of itself. We had a look at this in a data analysis that we did again quite a while ago now. So this was data based or an analysis based on data from 2005, so over 15 years ago. And this is something we're planning to redo in the next year or so. But large data set, almost 3,300 Canadian herds on DHI or lactanet milk recording that also had valid reproductive performance data in the system. And we did two analyses. This was my master's student, Molly Campbell, who did this work. Two analyses, one at the herd level and one at the cow level. So at the herd level, we used their annual the herd's annual 21-day pregnancy rate, which I said earlier was probably the best single metric that encompasses the efficiency of turning open cows into pregnant cows. Again, there are lots of different measures of production, just as there are for reproduction. We looked at 305-day yields of milk, protein, and fat. Of course, they're all quite correlated one with the other, and so we'll focus on mature equivalent milk yield 305. Mature equivalent meaning we can compare across lactations in an equal and fair fight basis. So at the herd level, there's a lot of numbers here, but I draw your attention to the top row in red. As herd average milk yield, 305 milk yield went up, pregnancy rate went up. So in other words, it was a positive or favorable relationship. And we accounted for some other things in the herd demographics like herd size and proportion of older versus younger cows, freestall versus tie stall housing and so forth. But the bottom line is exactly what you see here. As herd average milk yield went up by 1,000 kilos, 305, on average, the herd's pregnancy rate also went up by 0.7 percentage points. So a favorable association. When we went to the cow level analysis, so same data set, same that we extracted individual cow records from. So we had data on over 100,000 cows from 2,700 herds, cows that had at least 3 DHI or lactanet milk tests worth of data. So we knew that they had an accurate estimation of their milk yield. And we used similar statistical techniques to measure the time from calving until pregnancy. Again, remember these are older data. This is from 2005, but just by way of description. So these are cows that were on average making a little less than 10,000 kilos of milk, 305. If we were to do this again today, obviously these numbers would be higher, but this is what they were at the time. And again, it was important for us to check that there was no bias in the data, that farmers would somehow be selectively changing the time of first AI on the basis of the cow's milk yield. In other words, saying, well, this cow's a lower producer, I'll breed her sooner, or this cow's a higher producer, I'll wait on her. In fact, we did not see any evidence of that. If anything, as milk yield at first DHI test date went up, cows were bred very, very slightly sooner. I mean, we're talking here about a day or two, practically no difference. There was no bias. That was a good thing. So we could go on and assess various measures of milk yield against time to pregnancy. So we had 7 different ways of looking at milk production. So in test day yield for each of the first 3 test days, projected 305 milk yield based on each of the first 3 test days, and then their last recorded 305 towards the end of lactation. Again, what I want to draw your attention to here is these numbers, these hazard ratios. Any number that's above 1 is favorable. It means that their pregnancy, their 21-day pregnancy rate is higher. Their pregnancy rate is faster. They're getting pregnant sooner. Their days open is shorter. So by every measure, as production went up, pregnancy rate also went up. It was favorable. Now, these are very slightly above 1. So these are small effects. They're per kilogram, so they're not as tiny as they might seem. But that's where we're going with this. They were small effects, but favorable effects. So when we put that together in a slightly fancier model, trying to account for other variables, what we saw here was a little bit of a nuance, which was that accounting for both early lactation yield, so milk at their first test day, and also full lactation yield, you can see that this number is just slightly below 1, and this number is just slightly above 1. And again, each is on a per kilo basis. Remember that this is going to be in thousands of kilos because it's the whole lactation. This is going to be in, talking 30, 40, 50 kilos. So the amount of weight on this variable is actually much greater. But to cut to the chase, there were ultimately at the cow level statistically significant, but ultimately small associations. The effects were not large. So for example, 10 kilos more milk at first test was associated with actually a 3% increase in time to pregnancy, so worse, and 1,000 kilos increase in a full lactation 305 was actually associated with a favorable connection to time to pregnancy, so shorter time. One of my colleagues, Jocelyn Dubuc, saw this and took some data from herds in Quebec. So about 50,000 cows and nearly 1,500 herds a couple of years later, and found essentially the same thing. When they divided the cows up by the median, the midpoint of the data being above or below 8,500 liters, 305, no difference in time to pregnancy for higher versus lower producing cows. So if we turn our attention now to the third piece of the Triple Crown, health, this is a data set from large herds in the United States. So about 5,800, 5,700 high producing cows in large, high production herds in California. The cows were all on studies for synchronized breeding, pre-sync type programs in the early 2000s. But as part of this series of experiments about synchronization programs, they collected data on the cow's transition period health. And it won't surprise anyone that cows that had a difficult calving, metritis, endometritis, mastitis, lameness, ketosis, and so on, each of those things was not good for the cow's fertility in terms of pregnancy at first insemination. So you can see that cows that had any of these problems had lower fertility at or lower pregnancy at first insemination than cows that were healthy. No surprise. The two things I want to draw your attention to, first is this number. If one keeps careful track of most or all of the problems that can and do happen to cows around calving, in fact, only just in this data set, but others as well, only just more than half of the cows make it through the transition period without experiencing any of these health problems at all, if we're keeping careful track of them. So that's sort of the downside. That's our challenge. But our opportunity is that even in very large, very intense, very high producing herds, cows that stay healthy do very well in terms of their reproductive performance, at least in this example, in terms of pregnancy at first AI, which was over 50%. And certainly in the North American context, that is highly desirable and very much in the positive upper 10 to 20% of herd level performance. Back to Canada, again, these are some data from Quebec. Very large study, lots of herds, 126 herds. Each herd was visited a few times to collect a snapshot of health data for the cows in the herd. And their question was, like we saw here, any and every health problem is probably bad for fertility, but they were trying to get a little more detailed as to which ones, and are there some that are more influential than others. So visited these herds multiple times, looked at their records to know which cows had retained placenta, which cows had displaced abomasum, which cows had other clinical disease problems, proactively took blood samples to measure ketosis, albeit only once per cow, so that's going to be an underestimate, but still better than nothing. Did metra checks to identify cows with purulent vaginal discharge, did cytology to identify cows with endometritis, and took blood samples to identify cows that had not ovulated by the beginning of the breeding period. So cows that were truly anovular. As you would expect, each of these things was associated with worse reproductive performance. But what's unique here is that this is at the herd level, not just the individual animal level. And so the question was, each of these things would be bad for the cow that's affected, but at what point does it maybe become a problem for the herd? And so they took these 126 herds, broke them out by their pregnancy at first insemination. The top quartile, the top 25% of herds had over 40% pregnancy at first AI. And so they said, okay, what level of these problems is associated with the herd having worse performance than that? More than 12% of the cows with ketosis, again, that's only testing cows once, which we know is an underestimate. More than 5% of the cows with pus discharge at a month postpartum, more than 19% of the cows with endometritis based on cytology, more than 21% of the cows that are truly anovular, more than 4% of the cows in the previous year that had had a displaced abomasum. Each of those things was probably pulling down the herd's pregnancy at first AI, not just the individual animal, and therefore is a candidate to be worth management attention and investment to help reduce these levels at the herd. Again, it won't surprise anyone in this webinar today that cows that live through disease in the transition period, that's associated with worse reproductive performance. These are data from one very large herd in Florida that was assessed or analyzed by some of my colleagues here at the University of Guelph. Large data set, excellent records. And again, depending on herd level management, there is not necessarily any difference in time to first insemination, whether or not a cow lived through clinical disease, obviously, especially if first insemination is synchronized. So we have management tools to control time to first AI, but cows that live or had previously lived through clinical diseases as a transition cow were less likely to be pregnant at first AI, less likely to maintain a pregnancy and subsequently calve. And so they were less likely to get pregnant, less likely to stay pregnant. And that's sort of the double impact or the double whammy of having lived through transition disease. One of my postdocs a few years ago did a similar exercise from a large herd in Germany, excellent records from about 2,000 cows. And again, looking at whether cows had no clinical diseases, one clinical disease or two. Again, disease was never good. However, there were some differences. First lactation animals, whether if they only had one disease, tended to be more resilient to that. Their pregnancy rates were closer to healthy cows. Conversely, multiparous cows, second, third, fourth, fifth lactation, more than one disease was always worse than no disease, but in that case, any disease made a substantial difference from cows that had stayed healthy throughout the transition period. We'll jump past that one for now. There's an excellent review paper that was published last year by workers in both Brazil and the United States. It goes through a great deal of physiology and management, but one of the summary pictures that was in the paper is this one. And what I just want to draw your attention to is whether a herd chooses to manage reproduction primarily based on estrus detection, whether that's with activity monitors or human eyes or both, or primarily based on timed insemination and synchronization, there are some differences in the relative importance of some of the cow fertility factors. So for example, anovular cows is less of a problem with heavy synchronization than it is if we're depending on cows to show estrus. However, really the list of fertility factors is the same in both groups. And more to the point for today's discussion, what we lump under genetics, management, nutrition, and health is equally important to both approaches. So whether we're relying on cows to be detected in estrus or to be bred by synchronization or some hybrid of the two, each of management, health, nutrition, and genetic selection is important either way. And that's building towards what some colleagues have referred to as the high fertility cycle. And so to tee up this last piece of content, thinking about this high fertility cycle, one of the nuances that, back up, I hope I've already convinced you that there is not necessarily any antagonism between making a lot of milk and having good reproductive performance. In fact, at the herd level, those two things generally are favorably associated. At the individual cow level, there may be a little bit more nuance to it, but again, the effects are subtle. Health is a really important intervening variable, and so staying healthy is actually probably the bigger thing than how much milk does the cow make. And we can take that one step further, and body condition score, and in particular change in body condition after calving, seems to be really important to identifying the cows that are on this virtuous high fertility cycle. So Richard Persley and Milo Wiltbank and Paul Fricke have coined this high fertility cycle, which is sort of a virtuous or positive feedback loop whereby cows calve, in their description, don't lose too much body condition, stay healthy, get pregnant, stay pregnant, do so within an economically desirable interval. So back pregnant again within 4 months after the previous calving, and repeat this high fertility cycle multiple times in their life, as opposed to cows that come off of this positive cycle with health issues, with excessive body condition loss, with not getting pregnant quickly, and therefore perhaps becoming over-conditioned as they have a undesirably long lactation before they finally get pregnant and go dry, etc. These extra arrows are mine because I'm not sure whether, or rather, depending on the cow, cows that have health issues may then lose more body condition, or perhaps cows lose more body condition and are then more susceptible to health issues, lameness in particular, but that little cycle could probably begin with either of those conditions. So some data from California that nicely bring together both the production and the body condition score questions. So large data set, large herds, high production herds. Again, this is building off of some of the same data you saw before, nearly 7,000 cows. And again, high producing cows. So the second, third, fourth, fifth calvers peaking at nearly 50 kilograms of milk per day. On average, these cows were calving at what we consider to be a good body condition of 3.25. The cows, they took blood samples from the cows to see if they were cycling by breeding time, and did routine pregnancy checks to look at both early pregnancy and pregnancy losses. And again, they specifically asked the question, is higher production associated with worse reproductive performance? And the answer was no. So in this case, the first outcome was are the cows cycling again? Have they ovulated by the time we want to breed them? And we know that typically around 50% of cows in herds in Canada and the US, 20%, sorry, said that wrong. 20% of cows in herds in Canada and the US have not ovulated by the time we would like to breed them. And indeed, that's what they found here. But the only group that was worse off, in other words, had a smaller proportion of cows that had actually ovulated, was the lowest producing cows, not the higher producing cows. And again, we could speculate that the reason these were lower producing cows, perhaps that was just their genetic potential, but perhaps also these were cows that had lived through one or more disease events in early lactation. So now looking at pregnancy in that data set, no association of the level of milk yield with pregnancy to first insemination. However, where there was an association was with cows that were thin, so less than body score of 3 at calving, or that lost more than 1 point of body condition after calving. That was associated with worse pregnancy at first AI. And similarly, in terms of pregnancy losses following getting pregnant to first AI, no association of milk yield, but again, cows that calved thin or that lost a lot of body condition, those cows were at greater risk of losing their pregnancy, even though they managed to get pregnant after first AI. That's now been shown in several more recent data sets. So this is some work published more recently, a little bit more recently, from 2 herds in Wisconsin. Both herds were entirely on synchronized ovulation for first service. So that took that variable out of the equation. And they just looked at the cows that either lost body condition, maintained their body condition, or actually gained body condition after from week 1 to week 3. So again, this is very short-term changes, but it gives you the direction. And I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but the point is that there were actually about 1/3 of the cows that maintained their body condition, about 1/5 of the cows that actually gained body condition, and about 2/5 of the cows, but still less than half, that actually lost body condition from week 1 to week 3. And the picture is that there was a very strong, in fact, almost unbelievable, but association whereby cows that maintained body condition had better pregnancy at first AI than cows that lost, and cows that gained, again, it's almost unbelievably good, but the take home is that they had excellent pregnancy to first AI. Similarly, another data set from the United States, similar kind of a setup, cows that either maintained or gained body condition versus those that lost. So maintained or gained in black, lost in gray. 1/4 of the cows either maintained or gained body condition, this time from a week before calving until 4 weeks after calving. And again, similar sort of story. The absolute numbers varied between the first calvers and the older cows, but the pattern was the same. Cows that maintained or gained had excellent pregnancy to first insemination, 50% or more. Cows that lost did very much less well. So which cows actually maintain, or conversely, which cows lose condition? This is a very small data set from Brazil, so take this with a few grains of salt, but I think it probably gets the points correct. Cows that calve at a lean, not skinny, but lean body condition, so meaning body condition score of 3 or less, are much more likely to maintain or gain condition. Conversely, cows that calve, not necessarily fat, but perhaps a little heavier than ideal, so 3 1/4 or greater, those cows are much more likely to be the ones who lose condition. Again, we still have some work to do to sort out what comes first in terms of losing body condition as a risk factor for disease, or disease as a risk factor for losing body condition. But both are true depending on the cow and depending on the details. I think for the interest of time, I'll go past, well, no, what I'll mention here just very briefly, this is a study from the UK, very large data set. What I want to make the point here is that their question again was the same one we've been on all afternoon, which is what's the association between milk yield or components, so percent fat, percent protein, with pregnancy per AI. And so if you just look at the slopes of these lines, as for example, if we look at protein on the bottom here, so this is protein at first DHI test, as protein yield went up, pregnancy per AI also went up. As yield, liters per cow per day at milk test went up, predicted conception actually went up. However, the relationships became dependent. So it wasn't just about yield and it wasn't just about components. And the associations at first test versus second test look different. And so there were complex relationships. That's the bottom line. But first take home is, generally speaking, the associations were favorable. The key point, though, is, in fact, whether the associations were favorable or unfavorable, the amount of milk yield or of component yield actually, if you considered all other variables that go into reproductive performance, yield was a very small part of the picture. It's not to say it doesn't matter. And again, in this study, the association was favorable. But again, then this is something that's been missed in some other studies. If all we look at is yield, we can find whatever we find. But if we put it into context of other variables, in fact, yield by itself explains very little of the variation in actual reproductive performance. Last thing I'll leave you with as we zoom back out to think about, not just for a given cow or for a given herd, where I hope I've convinced you that production can go hand in hand with reproductive performance. Maintaining health is a critical piece to making that positive relationship actually happen. If we zoom out to the population level, in fact, there's another argument aside from individual farm or cow profitability, and that's the environmental footprint. So in fact, as cows go from being very low yielding animals to being quite high yielding animals, in fact, their carbon footprint or greenhouse gas intensity, the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent produced per kilogram of fat protein corrected milk, high producing cows per cow and per liter of milk have a much smaller greenhouse gas footprint than do lower producing cows. So the point being that there's another reason besides farm level profitability to pursue this virtuous combination of high health, high production, and high reproductive performance. So in fact, these things are, not only are they not antagonistic necessarily, they can actually be favorable. And that's driven by greater feed efficiency. So if we break this out by countries or regions of the world, developed dairy economies, developed dairy industries generally have much lower carbon footprints than less developed. And that's a function of feed conversion efficiency per liter of milk produced. And that's also been shown in some modeling studies. So with that, I'll conclude. My answer to the Triple Crown question is yes, we can have it all. Is that easy? No. Will that always be the case? No. But there isn't necessarily an antagonism, or not an insurmountable one, between high milk yield and excellent reproductive performance, with health being a really critical intervening variable or pillar of that Triple Crown. From the data I showed you today and some other published studies that I didn't show today, there's pretty consistently a positive association of production with pregnancy rate at the herd level. Higher producing herds, on average, have higher pregnancy rates than lower producing herds. Within a herd, and for individual animals, that relationship can be a little bit more variable. The association at the individual animal level varies from a small negative correlation or direction to a small positive correlation or direction. Emphasis on small. And so ultimately, my conclusion for today is that if we put the pieces in place to provide for and sustain excellent production, which is to say good nutrition, good cow comfort, excellent health management, that will put the foundation in place to support both, or in fact, all three of health, high yield, and good reproductive performance. I'll put in a shameless plug if you're interested in following research from my lab and my colleagues at the University of Guelph. That's our website. We're on Twitter as a dairy network, Dairy at Guelph, and my own Twitter feed as well. And with that, remind you to put your questions in the chat, and I will turn things back over to Mark to moderate our question time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you for sharing your expertise with us and our audience today. And as Stephen said, if you have any questions, please put them in the question box and we'll try to work through some of them right now. And the first question, I think this one's right in your wheelhouse, Stephen, is we got a couple questions coming in about transition and transition cow monitoring. Where would you start if you want to set up a monitoring program to assess how your transition cows are doing? What parameters would you collect? Whatnot to gauge if it's going well, or you need to do some further troubleshooting?
So I think that the first thing to do is make sure that at least within a farm, most clinical diseases are being recorded in a consistent way, so that you know how many cows had a difficult calving, a milk fever, case of mastitis, displaced abomasum, metritis, and so on. It won't surprise anyone, but there tends to be variability as to how these things get defined, but at the very least, have a clear definition for your own farm as to what constitutes a case. Record those using the same code so that person A and person B are entering the data in the same way. Also, that we want to know about disease events. So whether or not there's a treatment given, an antibiotic treatment or any other kind of treatment, we usually do a pretty good job about recording antibiotic treatments because we have to worry about withdrawal times, but we really want to know about the events, not just the treatments. So to me, that's the starting point. Many herds do that well, but for other herds, that's still a work in progress, and that is I would say, a good and necessary place to start. Once a good recording system is in place, then we start thinking about proactive monitoring of cows. So to go beyond the really big ticket items like clinical disease. So we're starting to think about more subtle things. Near the top of that list for me would be postpartum reproductive tract infections. So in other words, what some people call clinical endometritis, or is more correctly called purulent vaginal discharge. That's something you can check at about a month postpartum using a MetroCheck device or a vaginoscope or just a clean gloved hand. And that's, especially with respect to reproduction, that's an excellent starting place because that's a common problem. It affects typically about 15% of cows, but you're not going to know about most of it unless you go looking. It's very consistently associated with worse reproductive performance. As I showed you, it's probably a drag on reproductive performance in many herds. And depending on what country you're in, but many countries have approved effective treatment for the problem as well. So to me, that's a real opportunity. It's a common thing, it's a real problem, and it's something we can actually fix with an on-label treatment. A second one would be a ketosis monitoring program. And there's some controversy about to what extent ketosis is just an adaptation of cows to support high production, and it certainly is, but at a certain point it kicks cows into a higher risk category for clinical diseases, for being anovular, and ultimately for having worse reproductive performance. So again, we have excellent blood tests, milk tests, urine tests, which are cheap, easy to use, valid, and again, we also have reasonably effective treatments in terms of propylene glycol drenching and other things as well that can help improve the risk profile of cows that have experienced ketosis. So clinical disease records, checking cows for purulent vaginal discharge, and third would be a ketosis monitoring program to take things to higher levels of more proactive monitoring.
Excellent. What's your thoughts around voluntary wait period, Stephen? This has been a question that's come up a little bit more. I see it come up now more in the last couple of years. Some of it's been from the efficiency of these double off-sync programs that now effectively get cows pregnant for service very well. What's your thoughts about going about and setting a voluntary wait period so you can get the most production out of your cows? And how would you go about diagnosing, and just your thoughts around the process?
Yep. So at the end of the day, how soon to breed cows is primarily an economically driven decision. And I'm actually later this year will be hiring a postdoc with some expertise in economic modeling to revisit that question, particular to the Canadian situation. However, today's answer is based on older and not so old economic models is that we still would like cows to calve on a 12 to 13 month calving interval, even if, and in fact, I would even say, especially if they're very high producing cows, because a high producing cow, can she go longer as an open cow before she loses money? Yes. But if you want to optimize that she spends the most of her life maximizing her profit potential, no matter, it seems, how high producing she is, we'd still like her to be pregnant again by about 120, 130 days after her last calving. Now, that also means we would like her to be pregnant not sooner than about 85 days. If she's going to have a 12-month calving interval, that means getting pregnant at 85 days, not at 50 or 60. So it is actually possible to get cows pregnant too soon in terms of economics and profitability. So why do we breed cows at 50 or 60 days? Well, we kind of do that because we know that we might like to get some a little too early to try to balance out the ones that inevitably are going to get pregnant a little too late. And that's reasonable. The more we drive up success at first insemination and the more we control first insemination, then the less we need to be in a hurry to be breeding cows at 50 or 60 days in milk. If a cow comes into heat by herself at 50 or 60 days in milk, biologically, she is ready to get pregnant. Conversely, I wouldn't synchronize cows to have semen going into them for the first time at 50 or 60 days in milk. I would set that up, if we're doing synchronized breeding, either as plan A or as a backstop after some heat detection. I would aim to have that done 75 to 85 days in milk. Our target is to maximize the number of cows getting pregnant between 85 and 120, 130 days in milk. And so to me, there should be a backstop so that every cow, one way or another, synchronized or otherwise, has been bred by 85 days in milk, gets preg checked within about a month or so, and the ones that aren't pregnant are quickly managed to re-inseminate them so that every cow has at least 2 chances, ideally 3, to get pregnant within that sweet spot or be pregnant by 130 days in milk. All of that to say that, you know, if we had a program, whatever it looks like, that we could just dial in cows getting pregnant, when would I put that semen in them? Well, between 85 and 120 days, and probably somewhere around 100 days. Our very best programs, we're only getting about half the cows pregnant per round of insemination. So we still need to build in room for at least 2 chances for most cows. So again, all that to say, if we're using synchronization, I would be aiming to put that synchronized breeding into cows around 80 days, 75 to 85. And then after that, it becomes a herd specific thing. You know, as cows come into heat at 70, 60, or even 50 days in milk, do we want to use those opportunities and take some of those early pregnancies? Clearly, in some herds, that is the right thing to do. In other herds, we could say, well, no, we don't need to be in too much of a hurry because we know we won't lose track of that cow later on.
Cool. Just one final question we're going to put out here. In your research and looking into fertility, if cows do get sick in the transition cow period, how do we do best to go about recovering them and getting them back to the right spot? Because are they basically doomed there, or what can we do to what management practices can we put in play to make sure that they do have a chance at getting pregnant?
That is an excellent question. And the definition of an excellent question is that I don't have an excellent answer to it. But one of the active areas of research in our group and lots of others as well is precisely that. How can we best manage those cows that do unfortunately get sick? So somewhat obvious things: early detection, valid treatment. So using treatment that we know from published, well-controlled clinical trials is efficacious. So for example, we know that for cows that have metritis, smelly, fetid smelling discharge in the first week or so postpartum, with or without a fever, systemic antibiotic treatment with ceftiofur, ampicillin, or penicillin is a reasonable thing to do, and they will have better outcomes if we do that than if we don't do that. We think that inflammation is really the driver of some of these longer term effects on fertility. And so the concept is that we think we would like to control and reduce that lingering inflammation, especially to do with uterine disease. Exactly how best to do that, honestly, we don't know entirely. And so that's an area of active research. But again, for practical things, the going back out to the barn tomorrow morning and what are we going to do about all this, it would be to make sure that we have good systems in place for early detection of lameness, metritis, support of recovery of cows that unfortunately do get a displaced abomasum and so on, prevention of milk fever through diet and other means. Again, really it's that classic thing, you go to herds that are really successful, those herds that have high production, great health and really high pregnancy rates, and ask them what their secret is, and almost every one of them says, well, I don't know, I don't feel like I do anything special. And yet what they do is implement best practices really successfully: cow comfort, space, excellent feed, excellent bedding, excellent ventilation. And sometimes people are saying, well, yeah, I've heard all that before, tell me something new, tell me something different. Well, at the end of the day, those are really the most powerful things: air, quality feed, space, bedding. It's kind of boring, but boringly successful. Those really do seem to be influential factors to support the Triple Crown.
Very good. Just to kind of follow up on that. So in the last, you showed us basically the last 20 years and how things have grown, and we've seen gains in conception through the better development of sync programs, sensor technologies. In your genetics, you showed basically, you can see the day genomics selection became a primary tool, and we see that in our genomic data through our Elevate program, looking at DPR values, that DPR animals do get pregnant better than low DPR animals. It's pretty stark. So we've had all these technology gains in the last 20 years. What do you think the next decade is going to look like, Stephen? Where's the next opportunity you feel like is going to be out there, and what's your focus going to be on?
So I guess a couple things. I think, and this is a little bit of Back to the Future, but
yep.
I think that the beauty of the genetic selection is that it's permanent. It's baked in, and now that that's going in a positive direction, that will continue to improve. I think one of the things that's just getting going, but will feature more, is not simply getting pregnant, but expressing heat really well. We've got active research in that area looking for health-related things that help us predict which cows are going to show heat well. Other people are working on the genetics and genomics of that. So can we continue to achieve health production, reproduction, and do it in a way that we sort of get back to having cows that express heat strongly, so that our activity monitors or our cameras or even our humans can find those cows? Because I think, and that will be if we do it right, that will be a win-win-win for cows, farmers, and our social license, because generally speaking, the public and consumers like the idea of cows that wear Fitbits and have their needs met so that they express natural heats and so on and so forth. So I think that's going to be an area of increased emphasis. I think one of the holy grails, one of the great challenges now that we're doing quite well, or at least in the best herds are doing quite well about getting cows inseminated in an extremely efficient way, getting them pregnant in a quite efficient way. One of our next big hills to climb is keeping them pregnant. We know that there's quite a lot of pregnancy loss, especially early embryonic loss in dairy cows. Some of that's probably inevitable, but that's going to be one of our next things, is to understand that better and find ways to help, well, ultimately prevent that. In other words, that the pregnancies we do achieve actually result in calves and subsequent lactations, because that's another 10 to 20 percentage units of performance that are on the table. That's hard for us to do anything about right now, but I think that's gonna be an active area in the next 10 years.
That's great. But with that, Stephen, thank you for doing this webinar today. We invite anyone, the participants, to access our webinars on our website. You can look that up, and with that, we'll call it a wrap. And thank you again. Really enjoyed the subject and the discussion today. So appreciate your time, Stephen.
My pleasure. Thank you.